Hello, I'm Nikos Sifakis. In this presentation, I'm going to be talking about integrating English as a lingua franca in English language teaching. And in particular, I'm going to be discussing the concept of ELF awareness. I'd like to start by pointing out that ELF is defined as any interaction, but predominantly on the spoken domain, involving non-native speakers. The basic assumption here is that English is not a foreign language in the sense that ELF speakers are familiar with English throughout the biggest part of their lives, and they use English as their own language outside of the context of English language teaching. We looked at the special role of English in Kakru's concentric circles, and we distinguished between the inner, outer and expanding circles, and we also looked at the importance of communicative efficiency and proficiency in communicating in contexts involving non-native speakers. So Kakru's circles present a very interesting but very simplistic orientation of English. One way of looking at it, and the traditional way of looking at it, is the geographical orientation, where you have the geographical description of an inner circle with reference to specific countries like the UK, the USA, Australia, Canada, and so on. And of course, the native speaker varieties come from this specific inner circle. And it's more or less the same simplistic orientation goes with the other two circles, the outer circle and the expanding circle, with the expanding circle describing typically EFL contexts. When you look at the teaching orientation, however, you see that things become more and more complex. In other words, this is not geographically oriented. You can imagine a situation in the UK, a UK class with only non-native students of English learning English. So in this case, you will have a very typical international and intercultural learning context, in other words, an expanding circle context, but in an inner circle teaching geographical context in the UK. So things are much more complicated when we're dealing with the teaching orientation of Kakru's circles. And of course, when you talk about the communication orientation, things become more and more complicated, because in this case you have very shifting situations. Native speakers and non-native speakers can communicate anywhere. It doesn't matter where you are geographically. So the geographical orientation of the inner, outer and expanding circle are no more relevant or even appropriate as a defining model. And this brings us to the first discussion topic for this presentation. I'm asking you to think about the complexity in Kakru's descriptions of English, the geographical, the teaching and the communicational orientation. And think about your own teaching context with reference to these circles. Ask yourself the following questions. To what extent do you experience this complexity in your own teaching? Do you feel that it's not as simple as that, especially when you teach bilingual students in a very specific CLIL environment? Now, to address this question, you have to be as specific as possible and refer to characteristics of your teaching context, like the curricular orientation, textbooks that you use and whether they are EFL oriented and how much EFL oriented they are or not. Also, very importantly, you have to refer to assessment and testing methods. And I think that this would raise some very interesting discussions with regard to the status of English in your own teaching context. So when we think about ELF as any interaction involving non-native speakers, the question is, what can the teachers of English learn from this reality? And how they can incorporate the ELF reality in their own teaching context? Well, there's a lot of discussion about that, but one of the predominant models that attempts to do that is the model or theory or framework of ELF awareness. And this is what we're going to be talking about in this presentation. So what are the prerequisites to understanding ELF awareness? The first orientation, the first prerequisite is that you have to understand that ELF is not a language. ELF is not a linguistic variety that can be taught. You cannot teach ELF precisely because of its fluidity and flexibility. It's nothing like standard English. There are no textbooks, there are no dictionaries, there are really no course books. So the thing to think about with your tutor here is, to what extent does ELF have native speakers like EFL? EFL does have native speakers. So there are models of English language usage in the presence of a native speaker of English. What about ELF? How can we replace the notion of a native speaker, an EFL construct, in an ELF environment? Let me give you a hint. As Seidlhofer has mentioned, ELF doesn't have native speakers, but it does have a discourse community. So I urge you to think about this notion of a discourse community and try to reach a conclusion with your tutor. We know how ELF speakers behave in successful ELF interactions, and we can study the linguistic, discourse, and pragmatic elements of such interactions. But we should never forget that these data would never amount to becoming a model for the teaching of ELF, because the defining characteristic of ELF is that it is something that is very real. It is out there, it exists, we all know that, but it is fluid and intangible. In other words, ELF is not a thing, it's not a language or one single variety, but is a way of communicating successfully, communicational skills and strategies. The fact that it is a way adds further to its fluidity. So it's very difficult to talk about the ideal ELF speaker, precisely because there are so many different communicational contexts. You may be a successful and efficient ELF speaker in one context, but in another context you may have problems being understood. So as far as teaching is concerned, a question to ask is, well, we have the established way of teaching in an EFL context is, of course, the communicative language teaching orientation. The question is, to what extent does this CLT model feasible or possible or even desirable, but without the native speaker at the core of its essence? Think about that with your tutor. A further prerequisite to understanding ELF awareness is that many EFL learners are ELF users to some extent outside of the EFL classroom. So there is a mismatch, a disconnect between what is going on in a typical EFL classroom and perhaps your own CLIL classroom, and out of the classroom, what the learners do with English outside of the classroom. The key thing here to remember is the importance of bringing the learners' ELF reality, in other words, how they understand and how they use English outside of the EFL classroom, how to bring that inside the EFL classroom. However, if you remember from the first presentation on defining ELF, a key characteristic here is attitudes. The learners have to be open and favorable towards such a link between EFL and ELF, because sometimes learners may consider this integration of ELF within EFL to be unworthy of the EFL formal teaching environment, or even inappropriate and perhaps immoral. It has to do with attitudes. You have to engage your learners, approach the learners before you open up, before you make the link, at least explicitly, and invite them to think about their preconceptions about EFL and the importance of incorporating ELF in the classroom. But still, no matter what we do, it's certain that progressively, more and more today, we move towards a post-EFL environment in which we move away from the linear or one-dimensional orientation of looking at a student's life being identical with that of a user's life, in the sense that in EFL, students in the classroom are striving to become native speakers. That's the attitude here. That's the target, is to try to reach the native speaker aim. And they do that by sitting exams, standardized exams. And this is the same with the user's life. They only use English in the EFL classroom. In other words, they don't have an independent life as a user of English, or at least this is not acknowledged by the teacher in a typical EFL context. On the other hand, in the post-EFL, or if you like, in the ELF context, English is not viewed as a foreign language. This is not a linear orientation, but a non-linear and a two-dimensional orientation. In other words, a student's life is different from a user's life. Students are still striving to become a native speaker, but they have a life outside of the classroom where they use adequately and successfully the language. So think about this as the next discussion topic with your tutor. Think about your own students and try to decide to what extent your students are learners of English and users of English. Try to provide as many examples from your own experience that prove that your learners are users of English independently of your EFL context. Let's go back to the prerequisites to understanding ELF awareness. ELF cannot, will not, and should not replace EFL. It should become incorporated, integrated within it. The underlying assumption here is that EFL cannot deny the existence of ELF. In other words, ELF is useful for EFL. However, there are no textbooks, there are no grammar books or dictionaries, which means that every ELF integration will be different. But the key question to ask yourselves here is, if this is okay and we agree to make the link or the integration of ELF within EFL, how do we do it? What pedagogy are we going to be using? Because we have certain decisions to make that we cannot bypass. In other words, the pedagogy we will choose for integrating ELF will very much determine how we perceive EFL teaching in general. So the bottom line, in order for ELF integration to succeed in EFL settings, is the following. Learners should embrace it, at least to some extent. And of course, yourself as a teacher. Teachers should be in some control of their teaching context. In other words, you should be autonomous. You should be able to make a decision to incorporate ELF. Teachers should integrate appropriate activities that raise learners' confidence as ELF users. So moving away from the user trying to become a native speaker. Teachers should target learners' attitudes towards ELF concerns. Remember, attitudes are very, very important. In other words, ELF awareness as a concept is not just becoming aware of ELF, it's a lot more than that, as we're going to see. So, as a teacher and as a syllabus designer of your own teaching context, ask yourself the following question. In integrating ELF within EFL, is it worth pursuing the same paths that we do for EFL? That is, design a specific core curriculum for ELF? Are we going to be using the same syllabus, the same curriculum every time we incorporate ELF in our class? That's a really important question to ask. Try to think of everything we've said before about ELF. So, how do we define ELF-aware pedagogy? It's the process of engaging with ELF research and developing your own understanding of the ways in which it can be integrated in your classroom context through a continuous process of critical reflection, design, implementation, and evaluation of instructional activities that reflect and localize your interpretation of the ELF construct. In other words, to become ELF-aware, you need to constantly develop and experiment with new ways of incorporating the reality of your learners outside of the class in the EFL classroom. And this necessitates that you incorporate a critical element, a reflective element that deals with your own and, of course, your learners' attitudes towards ELF. ELF awareness has three components. Awareness of language and language use. That could be the typical awareness of the existence of ELF. The second component is awareness of instructional practice, or being aware of how we teach. And the third one is awareness of learning. Let's have a look at these three components quickly. The first one is awareness of language and language use. This means becoming engaged with language, with ELF, in communication. So in this case, you expose your learners to successful examples or excerpts of ELF interactions. And you can take these examples from corpora, from ELF corpora, like the voice corpus. And there are other inventories of ELF, successful ELF interactions. While you do this, it's a good idea to engage your learners by asking them to notice all the various syntactic, morphological, lexical, phonological, or pragmatic and socio-cultural features of that discourse, of ELF discourse. And the idea here is to make them sensitive to these structures. So you raise their awareness of the existence of these structures by making them notice, by becoming alert to these stimuli. In other words, you make them aware of language as a process of communication and of translanguaging as a means of any other means that you have at your disposal, linguistic or otherwise, in order to have a successful interaction with other non-native speakers. And this involves making your learners aware of their own preconceptions or attitudes about all the things that are relevant with EFL, with ELF, such as the normativity, standardness, appropriateness, comprehensibility, and ownership. How you do this? By developing activities that are not linguistic activities, but meta-linguistic activities. In other words, they focus on asking your learners to focus on how ELF communication works successfully. That's what you do. You take all these examples from ELF corpora and you raise your learners' awareness of them, and at the same time you ask about their attitudes and you try to see if they are shifting towards accepting these deviations from standard English. The second component of ELF awareness is awareness of your own instructional practice, the way that you teach. Is it a teacher-centered practice? What do you do? What do you do not do? How does the textbook allow you to move with non-standard varieties of English and with ELF? Also, what is your own personal theory about instruction, where to give corrective feedback, how you're dealing with your learners' mistakes and your learners' real communicative needs, and your own self-perception as a language user and as a role model for your learners. That's really important because we mentioned that attitudes are really important, and in this case this is also true, and you are also involved as a teacher. So in practice, to raise awareness of instructional practice, you need to develop metacognitive activities, thinking, in other words, about the origin of all these perceptions. You ask essentially why you have these perceptions, why you correct when you correct, and so on. And the last component of ELF awareness is awareness of learning. In this case, you look at the use of English outside of the classroom and you try to see to what extent that use of English can impact or influence your learners' learning. You look at where learning takes place in different settings, and of course this means that you consider English as a language with which your learners are familiar with, and therefore using it outside of the classroom makes them improve the learning of that language. So in practice, what you can do in the actual classroom is incorporate authentic tasks with realistic communicational goals, and you can ask your learners to reflect on their own convictions about what works in communication in English. What's the bottom line with ELF awareness? What you should know? 3 things. First of all, know your teaching context really, really well. Not all teaching situations are the same. Different situations have different goals, different expected outcomes, and different practices. So you cannot incorporate the same amount of ELF in every teaching context. So know the context. Secondly, know your learners. You have to make this about themselves, their own use of English. And finally, know yourself. Know your own reaction, your own deeper convictions about your own role. Are you a guardian of proper English? Is this how you consider your role, your presence in the EFL classroom? Or would you see yourself more as a facilitator or prompter of authentic interactions? If the latter is the case, then of course you see yourself as a prompter of learners to be themselves rather than someone else, like a native speaker, to the extent, of course, that they are willing to do that. And finally, you have to welcome change. And you have to think about these very important bullets that I'm asking you to think about with your tutor. First of all, what is taught is not necessarily what is learned. What your learners will be exposed to doesn't mean that they will learn it. So we have to rethink about the way that we provide correction and feedback. You have learning at the back of your mind and as the ultimate goal every time you teach. Secondly, we should go beyond EFL in the post-EFL case, and we should be working with and building upon what our learners already do with English. And finally, you should understand that EFL is not something that we should be leaving behind. We still, of course, need EFL. This is a very tangible orientation, a very real orientation professionally. All we're saying is that it's important to have at your disposal to be able to incorporate ELF as an additional professional skill in case you might need it. So, ELF awareness is an opportunity for professional development, and that's really, really important. Thank you for watching this presentation. I hope you enjoyed it and found it useful. Goodbye.